Good morning, all, and welcome to today's press call hosted by the American Immigration Lawyers Association and the American Immigration Council on Biden's first 100 days. Just a few housekeeping items. Today's call is being recorded. We will circulate the recording and new reports on Biden's first 100 days from AILA and the American Immigration Council following the call. If possible, please save your questions for the designated Q&A period following speakers' remarks. Questions can be typed into the Q&A chat box, and please include reference to your news outlet in the chat. If you have called into this session via the phone number in the invite, you will not have access to the Q&A box, but feel free to email me at your earliest convenience with your question. My email is twiseman@aila.org. Thank you. I will now turn the call over to Greg Chen, Senior Director of Government Relations at AILA.
Thank you so much, Tessa. And welcome to everybody who has joined us for this press call. I'm going to begin by introducing all the speakers and then make some brief remarks and then turn it over to the other speakers. I am Greg Chen, the Senior Director for Government Relations at the American Immigration Lawyers Association. Joining me today for this press conference, first up, is going to be Leon Rodriguez. He is a partner at the law firm of Seyfarth Shaw, and perhaps most prominently or best known, he directed USCIS during the last years of the Obama administration, which gives him a special perspective on the operations from inside the agency. Next up, you'll be hearing from Jorge Loweree, who is the Director of Policy at the American Immigration Council. He also had worked previously for the current governor of Colorado, Jared Polis, while he was still serving in Congress. Next up, you will be hearing from Chev Dalal-Dheini, who is the Director of Government Relations at AILA, and also has spent time at USCIS. She was there for more than a decade in various capacities. And lastly, you'll hear from Reichlin-Melnick, who is a policy counsel at the American Immigration Council. Today, AILA releases a comprehensive review of President Biden's immigration actions in its first 100 days in office. Our review is a web-based resource with 12 charts showing what Biden has accomplished and what still remains to be done. We evaluated the president based on recommendations that AILA made to the president when he was first elected in November. We wrote these recommendations drawing upon the expertise of our national AILA member committees in a wide range of various topics. Called A Vision for America as a Welcoming Nation, that comprehensive set of recommendations covered the widespread of all the concerns we had about the previous administration's practices on immigration. In fact, those policies of the previous administration had devastating consequences for American families, businesses, and others who rely upon it. It also ravaged the immigration system itself. And President Trump turned, for example, the immigration benefit system, about which you'll hear a lot more today, on its head, moving it away from the mission it has of adjudicating applications for immigration benefits fairly and efficiently. He also transformed the immigration courts that are supposed to be fair and neutral into machines more focused on deportation. Now, President Biden in his first 100 days has quickly implemented solutions to ameliorate the harmful policies of his predecessor. Since entering office, the president delivered on many of these recommendations with actions that carry both symbolic force and the power to impact people's lives directly. But he is also being tested by those resistant to his vision of a more welcoming America, who are using the controversy, for example, at the border, to impede any kind of reform. In the areas of detention reform, immigration courts, and humanitarian protection, the administration has made the least progress and has even backed away from some of its pledges. The test of his leadership will be whether he will stand by his plan for a fair, humane, and efficient immigration system when he is challenged again. On his side will be the American people who will time and again continue to support immigration and the path to citizenship for people who are unauthorized, as polls have consistently shown year after year. They've done that even though the last 4 years have had constant attacks on immigrants. With the American people by his side, the president can get immigration reform done, as can Congress. I'm now going to turn it over to Jorge Loweree of the American Immigration Council.
Thank you, Greg. And thank you all for joining us this morning. My name is Jorge Loweree, and I am the Policy Director with the American Immigration Council. The Council has this morning, just a few minutes ago, published a new special report tracking the Biden agenda on legal immigration in the first 100 days. It is available on our homepage, americanimmigrationcouncil.org. We can also follow up with an email with the link after the call. But the Trump administration was very successful in reducing legal immigration to the US. And government data released just last week provides the most complete picture yet of the impact of the changes implemented over the last 4 years. As a candidate, President Biden worked to aggressively distance himself from many of the policies of the prior administration directly attacking access to the US system of legal immigration, acknowledging that immigration is essential to who we are as a nation, our core values, and our aspirations for our future. And 100 days after inauguration, the administration has made considerable progress in meeting some of its commitments and in setting a new direction regarding the overall treatment of immigrants in the US and abroad. Nevertheless, progress has been limited by some of the overlapping policies and barriers created by the prior administration, and there are clear additional changes that the Biden administration can and must consider for the spirit of many of their changes to be fully realized. So the Council's report contains a detailed analysis of the impact of the most significant changes implemented by President Trump, as well as the changes implemented by the Biden administration during its first 100 days. It also includes recommendations for next steps. But with that, I will turn it back to Greg to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Jorge. I am now just going to pass it right over to Leon Rodriguez. Leon.
Great. Good morning. It's great to be here with everybody, and I'm thankful to AILA for inviting me. As both Greg and Jorge referenced, notwithstanding that there's a lot more work to do, there already have been some significant accomplishments by the Biden administration in the immigration space, most of them really focused on reversing actions taken, or the most draconian of the actions taken by the Trump administration. So examples of that are the decision of the administration to no longer defend the Trump public charge rule and to suspend its implementation. And just a couple of days ago, we had an announcement by the USCIS reversing what's called the, or rather reinstating what had historically been called the deference policy, which basically established that if you had been approved for a benefit earlier, whatever findings were made in the course of approving that benefit would be honored in later extension applications for that benefit. That not only promotes a more fair immigration system, it also promotes a more efficient one. And there have been other suspension of some business immigration regulations that would have had really horrendous impact on a lot of foreign national workers in the U.S. But meanwhile, we're still in many respects in the middle of a transition. And the Biden administration, consistent with what we've seen from other administrations, even before it puts a Senate-confirmed appointee into USCIS and other agencies, has already put political appointees in critical positions within USCIS with the charge of implementing its mission. Most importantly, you have Felicia Escobar Carrillo, who is the Chief of Staff. Felicia worked at the White House Domestic Policy Council, holding the immigration portfolio for a substantial part of the Obama administration, and is somebody who knows USCIS well and is well known within USCIS. And so you really have a really top-notch team already in there implementing the administration's vision. Of course, we're awaiting the confirmation process for Or Jadu, who I think is a fabulous nominee, somebody who was my chief counsel when I was director, and who really, of all of us who have ever been nominated for that position, has the deepest background in immigration law and policy of anyone. But what's the dynamic that's now going to occur? You're going to have some big ideas coming from the White House. Those will need to deal with the reality, and that's where the interplay between the political leadership that I just described and the career leadership within USCIS, who I think is an incredibly strong and capable group of people, work toward implementing the president's vision and work toward implementing it in a way that is operationally sound, that makes sense in terms of those immigration services officers that will need to implement that vision on the ground. And that takes a bit of time. And so while I think there is some eagerness to see some of these changes, not just reversing Trump administration policy, but at the same time sort of moving forward and implementing new ideas and making some progress, all of that is being handled, I think, to the administration's credit and to USCIS's credit in a methodical manner that really honors the operational realities that need to be heeded in implementing these changes. For my money, there are two critical priorities that need to guide USCIS going forward. One is restoring the operational health of the agency. As we know, last summer, the agency was on the verge of furloughs. Notwithstanding a mission statement that they would be more fair and efficient or something like that, the reality was that processing times climbed and climbed and climbed throughout the last 4 years. And as a result, even now, for example, citizenship application, which should be targeted at 5 months from the time that it's filed until the time somebody takes the oath, is running at 16.5 to 22.5 months. So that's got to be a priority to deal with that. And the second, of course, is to deal with really reforming both the asylum system and restoring the refugee admission system. And with that, Greg, I'll give it right back to you.
Great, thank you so much, Leon. Now I'm going to pass it over to Chev Dalal-Dheini, who also spent many years over at USCIS. Chev?
Great, thanks, Greg. As someone who worked at USCIS through 3 different administrations, I can attest that the transition period in the first 100 days can be a very exciting yet anxiety-producing time for career staff who are waiting to find out who their leadership will be and what their marching orders will be. But as Leon said, they are armed with the history, skills, and knowledge to help administration do the work to implement new practices and policies to fulfill the administration's objectives. And I feel like this time around, USCIS has significant marching orders and a lot of work to do, some of which can be done more quickly and some that will require going through longer legal processes to ensure lasting change. And just to say, they have definitely gotten to work fast. From the start of his term, President Trump effectively built an invisible wall to immigration by introducing policies at every level, from executive orders down to detailed agency procedures that were designed to block access to legal immigration benefits and slow down the processing of applications. During this time, there was a well-documented shift in USCIS's priorities from an agency charged with the effective and efficient administration of immigration benefits to one that had distanced itself from its customer service roots and that honored our nation's history of immigration. Some changes were overtly anti-immigrant, such as changing the agency's mission statement, creating a public charge wealth test, increasing fees, and fulfilling mandates of the Buy American, Hire American executive order. Other changes were subtle, but equally impactful, such as the rescission of the adjudicator deference memo that Leon mentioned, mandating interviews and biometrics even when unnecessary, and closing off avenues of redress. Each of these changes, and hundreds of others, deliberately slowed down USCIS's processing of legal immigration benefits, leading to an overall increase of 101% in case processing times from fiscal years 2014 to 2019. That increase occurred even though the actual receipts that USCIS received decreased by 10% from 2017 to 2019. These delays have resulted in individuals falling out of lawful status, being separated from their families, and losing their jobs and ability to drive even, due to no fault of their own. Moreover, USCIS's move away from customer service left applicants, their families, and their employers without administrative recourse to get their cases adjudicated, forcing many to turn to the federal courts for relief. To bring fairness and transparency back into the legal immigration system, AILA called for greater accountability, accessibility, and consistency at USCIS. Additionally, AILA has called for the restoration of customer service and public engagement. Moreover, we made recommendations for strengthening naturalization, family-based, and employment-based immigration programs, among others. During his first few weeks in office, President Biden has taken steps to dismantle the invisible wall by issuing an executive order on legal immigration, which directed agencies to identify barriers that will impede access to immigration benefits and fair and efficient adjudications, such as the USCIS fee rule and the public charge regulations. In response, USCIS halted implementation of the fee increase rule and notified the public that they would no longer defend the public charge regulations, removing them and one of the most burdensome forms in the history of immigration applications from the books. Similarly, President Biden issued an executive order rescinding the Buy American, Hire American EO, which led to the reversal or delay of some very restrictive H-1B and employment-based policies. In important steps towards more efficient and fair processing of adjudications, USCIS reinstated its deference policy to ensure consistencies for individuals who have been living and working in this country. It rescinded its harmful blank space rejection policy and removed barriers to naturalization by reinstating a fairer civics exam. Already, we've seen a change in USCIS's willingness to engage with the public and implement reforms. However, USCIS processing times remain at crisis levels, and many of the detrimental policies that have led to unlawful and inconsistent adjudications are still in place. USCIS must take steps to reduce these delays by rescinding these policies and streamlining the adjudications process. This can be done by retraining and properly staffing adjudicators, adjudicating related cases together, requiring biometrics appointments and interviews only when necessary, reducing unnecessary requests for evidence and arbitrary rejections, and fully implementing the Emergency Stopgap USCIS Stabilization Act to help improve processing times. USCIS must return to its customer service roots by providing better access to agents to resolve issues and having robust stakeholder engagements to fulfill its mission of efficiently administering immigration benefit and applications. With that, I'll transition it back to, give it back to Greg.
Thanks so much, Chev. You're going to hear back again with Jorge Loweree. Jorge?
Thanks, Greg. So, as I mentioned earlier, the American Immigration Council just published a special report analyzing the impact of major Trump-era policies on the system of legal immigration in the US, and the progress that the Biden administration has made in meeting some of its commitments to repair the damage over the last 4 years. The report also contains specific recommendations for next steps for the administration as it transitions into its next 100 days. The Council's report analyzes the latest government data that makes clear just how effective the Trump administration was at reducing and reorienting legal immigration in the US and using executive authority and the power of the federal bureaucracy to shut out people that the Trump administration deemed to be undesirable. Primarily people seeking to come to the US through close family ties, the diversity category, and as refugees, while also simultaneously managing to boost employment-based immigration. As a candidate, President Biden made significant commitments on immigration, both in repairing some of the damage created by the Trump administration, but also to pursue some of the reforms that have eluded Congress for decades. And the Council's report offers an assessment of the progress that has been made by the administration in these 100 days in terms of restoring legal immigration in the US. The Biden team started off strong by making use of the president's executive authority to end some of the most pernicious policies and travel bans implemented by the prior administration, and by sending an ambitious proposal for legislative reform to Congress. But the council's special report details that a great deal of work really remains to be done for the spirit of those changes to be fully realized. You've already heard a great deal about issues at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, so I will focus primarily on issues within the Department of State, confronting non-citizens abroad. The Trump administration implemented a series of travel bans targeting specific populations of non-citizens around the world and using COVID-19 as a pretext to pursue some of the policy changes that it had sought for years. The prior administration also suspended visa processing at US embassies and consulates abroad in March of last year. And these changes created overlapping barriers to many non-citizens abroad, meaning that simply removing one or two of them is not enough to restore meaningful access to the immigration system for many people. Collectively, these changes resulted in a full 94% reduction in the issuance of visas abroad between January and May of last year. And this sharp reduction resulted in the loss of over 100,000 visas for families and people in the diversity category last year, increasing already extensive backlogs that plagued the system. And critically, the number of non-citizens obtaining green cards through family ties plummeted by 40% between 2019 and 2020. But during this very same period, the number of people obtaining green cards through employment actually increased by approximately 7%, revealing the true intent behind the Trump administration's various bans that use COVID-19 as a pretext to target specific populations of immigrants with surgical precision. And while the Biden administration has taken a number of important steps to reverse these trends, there are critical changes that they should turn to immediately in order to prevent an even greater reallocation this fiscal year. So the Biden administration obviously rescinded the Muslim and African ban, the COVID-related bans, but it has yet to make significant progress in restoring visa processing around the world. 76% of embassies and consulates had either not resumed visa processing or had only done so partially at the beginning of this month. And the latest data reveals that while visa processing did increase last month, it still remains at just 2/3 of what it was last March when visa processing was initially suspended. Fully restoring visa processing is a critical and necessary step in eliminating the virtual wall that Trump and Stephen Miller erected to accessing the US immigration system. It's of little benefit to remove blanket bans of specific non-citizens if they can't move forward with scheduling interviews to obtain visas to ultimately come to the US. But obviously COVID-19 remains a significant concern, but people coming to the US to reunite with family permanently is and should be considered essential travel. And there are specific measures that could be implemented to address public health concerns, including testing before and or after arrival, quarantining, et cetera. We can do this. There are also measures that the administration should consider to protect consular staff, such as prioritizing vaccinations in the same way that the Department of Homeland Security has prioritized vaccinations for its own frontline employees. Doing things like automatically extending the validity of expiring visas, permitting visa validation from within the United States, waiving certain in-person interviews for efficiency, among others. These are detailed in the council's report. But they're relatively straightforward changes that the administration must consider implementing now. President Biden's first 100 days were a success in signaling a very different and new way forward on immigration. His next 100 days must be characterized by meaningful action to address the ongoing hardship experienced by immigrants and their families created by Trump's invisible wall. But with that, I'll hand it back to Greg to introduce our next speaker.
Great, thanks so much, Jorge. And next up is Reichlin-Melnick, also of the American Immigration Council. Aaron?
Thank you, Greg, and thank you all for being here. Today, I want to talk about what the Biden administration has done on interior enforcement, what's happening inside of ICE. I would also note, like Jorge said, we have a report on legal immigration out, and we are actually planning to publish a report on interior enforcement and ICE coming soon, so please keep an eye out for that. When President Biden took office, Immigration and Customs Enforcement had become one of the most politicized agencies in the entire federal government. According to Pew Research polls conducted in 2019 and 2020, ICE is the least popular major federal agency in the country by a wide margin. The previous administration frequently used ICE as a mouthpiece for its political agenda, including appalling behavior such as putting up wanted billboards and carrying out highly publicized immigration raids in swing states ahead of the election. Yet, despite all the focus on ICE from the previous administration, ICE deportation numbers over the last 4 years failed to reach even half the level of President Obama's first term. However, one area where the previous administration expanded the enforcement apparatus significantly was immigration detention, which reached record levels in 2019 with more than 55,000 people locked up facing deportation in August of that year. After taking office, President Biden moved swiftly to carry out his promised 100-day pause on deportations while ICE conducted a top-to-bottom review of enforcement policies put in place during Trump. As many of you all know, this deportation moratorium, however, was swiftly blocked in court in a lawsuit filed by Texas, and the Biden administration has chosen not to fight that decision, indeed has not sought a stay or appealed the decision as of yet. Following the failed deportation moratorium, the Biden administration has moved more slowly to dismantle the previous administration's harmful policies. Although the administration issued new interim enforcement priorities, anecdotal reports indicate that local offices are moving slowly to carry out these new priorities, and for many cases, it is business as usual. However, ICE has importantly created a new case file review process. The downside of that file review process is that it requires individual immigrants and their advocates to request a review, which puts the burden on the immigrant rather than on ICE to determine whether somebody is still a priority for the agency. This process has met with some successes, but not nearly enough given the fact that there are still thousands of people in detention. In recent weeks, we've also seen ICE arrests slowly drop as the new enforcement priorities go into effect. The number of people sent to detention following arrest by ICE inside the country has steadily gone down since President Biden took office, dropping from around 6,000 a month in October through December of last year to below 2,500 a month in February through March. And just this week, ICE agreed to no longer arrest people who are appearing for other hearings at courts around the country, with only a few exceptions, all of which require detailed sign-off from higher-level officials. But despite this drop in internal ICE enforcement actions, we are seeing detention levels go back up, driven by the Biden administration sending more people to detention from the border. In March, more than 10,000 people were sent to detention from the border, a number which will climb to over 12,000 in April. And ICE detention numbers are indeed rising, having dropped down to a low of just below 14,000 a couple of months ago and are now rising steadily again. I believe they are now above 15,000. ICE detention centers also remain hotbeds for COVID, with case numbers climbing significantly over the last month. We continue to urge the Biden administration to stop sending people to detention during a pandemic and finally begin the process of dismantling the expensive and unnecessary detention apparatus that has been built up over the last 30 years. That's why we can say that the Biden administration's record in the first 100 days on ICE enforcement is mixed. There have been several positive changes, but they have been slow, and the deportation moratorium that was promised never ended up happening. In addition, detention levels are going up despite the Biden administration's promise to limit detention. That's why we hope when the 100-day review that the Biden administration promised is completed and new, more final enforcement priorities go into effect, permanent changes are made to the system to improve it. But we remain willing to give the Biden administration time to put their changes in effect, but we remain considerably concerned. We remain concerned about the Biden administration's failure to move as quickly as we think they need to do, especially with the ongoing pandemic and the health risks posed to people in detention. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Greg.
Thank you, Aaron. And the American Immigration Lawyer Association certainly shares those concerns that Aaron just described about the lack of progress in some of those areas, such as detention reform. The administration's progress so far on the aspect of the Department of Justice and its intersection with immigration is another area of substantial concern for AILA. In fact, the Attorney General has yet to announce any major policy on immigration. Underneath the authority of the Department of Justice are a realm of different immigration sub-agencies, including the immigration courts, the Office of Immigration Litigation, which handles appeals and prosecution of immigration cases. And the critical problem without having any leadership at the Department of Justice exercising its policy authority on immigration is that we have a vacuum here. And one example is where this gap is so critically needed is with respect to the immigration courts, which under the previous administration were again turned on their heads in terms of their responsibility to make the system more fair, more reliable in terms of adjudications of courts, while also being efficient. To make the courts fair and more functional, it's really critical now that President Biden rescind a number of opinions that were issued by his preceding attorneys general, Barr and Sessions, and also to address regulations that were put in place that collectively strip immigration judges of essential fundamental powers they need to effectively manage their dockets. In addition, there were several of these kinds of regulations and also opinions that undermine US asylum law and due process. Why are these kinds of changes so important, and why is it so important for the Department of Justice to lean into this? Well, more than half of the currently sitting immigration judges, it's about 300 now, that are appointed by President Trump. And the court's leadership itself is largely still dominated by his appointees. The failure to act in this area would allow the entrenchment of the previous administration's practices, which resulted in an escalating level of numbers of cases for asylum denied by the courts, which has reached the highest denial rate in history of 72% in 2020. So to properly address the court backlog, the AG really must not only restore these fundamental authorities to the judges, but it also should review the 1.3 million case backlog that is clogging the courts at this point. By our estimate, about 700,000 cases could be designated as non-priority cases for the administration not to put at the front of the court's docket and to shift off the docket so more important, more priority matters can be handled. The president asked not only the Homeland Security Secretary, Ali Mayorkas, but also the Attorney General to issue enforcement priorities. And still, Department of Justice has not done anything in this regard, even though DHS has issued 2 memos already on enforcement priorities. So we think this is a fundamental area where there's a gap. The other area I'll focus on, in the interest of time, I'm going to keep my comments short, is on humanitarian protection, where the president's response has generally been a bit weaker. While he's taken some steps to improve asylum procedures, he has not executed on promises that he made to welcome asylum seekers to the United States, as well as refugees. In the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on the asylum seeker aspect, and notably, the president has left in place the discredited Title 42 ban that the Trump administration put in place after pressuring the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to issue this ban under the false pretext that it would protect public safety and health during the COVID pandemic. This ban under the Biden administration has resulted in the wrongful expulsion of asylum seekers from Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, as well as other nations such as Haiti and Cameroonians. That simply needs to be revisited, and we are looking and hoping that the administration will turn its attention back to these concerns. And we recognize that there is substantial controversy about an influx of migrants coming in at the southern border. This is going to be a real test of the president's leadership, whether or not he's going to lean into the principles that he has already lifted up and talked about in the face of real challenges and real controversy. We believe that with the American public so strongly in support of immigration reform and in favor of immigration generally, and this has withstood the test of time, even during the President Trump administration, we think that President Biden will have the backing of the American public over the long term for these changes. With that, that concludes our formal remarks. I'm going to now open this up for Q&A. I would recommend that reporters should use the Q&A chat function if you're on video, and if you're only on telephone, that you can use the telephone command. I'm going to bring this back to Tessa, who can give you further instructions on that. Tessa?
Thank you, Greg. Yeah, if folks who want to ask questions can go ahead and type them in the chat box, we will take them from there.
Do we have any questions here from reporters?
Seeing none so far, I think I can hand it back over to Greg for any final remarks, and then I can just follow up with a few instructions after the call.
Great. I'm just going to open the floor here. Does anybody have any final remarks that you'd like to add to your also eloquent comments from before? I hear Leon talking. I think you're on mute. Go ahead, Leon.
Make sure that you can actually hear me. Yeah, no, the one thing that I always want to add, and it does look like we have a question in the chat box, is that, you know, the framework that I think we need to apply when we look at these things is, what are we doing to fix what was wrong? But we also need to stay also focused on what do we want to do to things to make things even much better than they ever were. And that's a big lift, and it's a lot to ask. But there's so much that needs to be fixed that I think we're always at risk of getting lost in talking about the forward-looking things that we'd like to see. And so one thing, you know, for example, one thing that I would like to see is a vast increase in our levels of refugee admission, apropos of a point that you made earlier. But I do see that we have questions now in the chat box.
Thanks so much, Leon. And I see two questions here. I will just add a quick comment regarding refugees. I didn't elaborate upon it just given time. But of course, this was something that the president had made a firm promise that he would increase the refugee levels for just this current fiscal year, 2021, to 62,500. And as I think has been widely reported, that has not happened. We are hoping that in mid-May, as he had indicated, we'll see an increased level. But we think, and there's been reporting about this, that the president's step back on this, again, is a kind of a test in terms of how he will respond during these kinds of controversies on these issues. But there's been so much support for the president's positions overall that we really recommend he lean into it. With that being said, I'm going to raise up a question. I'm going to turn this first to Aaron. It was directed at both me and Aaron. I'm from Farida. I'm asking about the increase of ICE detainees coming from the border, and what is the connection with the backlog of cases in the immigration courts? Are most of the people held from the border asylum seekers? And also, how many of these new detainees are asylum seekers? Go ahead, Aaron, you start first.
Yeah, so statistically, I can't give an exact number on this because there is no clear definition of asylum seeker, and the data does not separate out those who have passed a credible fear interview or those who are simply waiting for a credible fear interview. However, that being said, we are seeing the number of people held in detention who have in fact passed credible fear interviews go back up again. It is only gone up by several hundred, so it is unclear whether that is because more people arriving at the border are still going through the credible fear process and have not been added to the process system, or whether ICE is using these detention centers as temporary holding locations in order to deport people under Title 42. One underappreciated facet of Title 42 is that ICE can sometimes hold people for days or weeks prior to a deportation and still claim that they are doing so in order to protect the American public from COVID-19, despite the fact that they could have easily tested the person to determine whether or not they had the virus while they were stuck in an ICE detention center for days or weeks. So the answer is it's not fully clear, but what we are seeing is a clear trend of people being booked into detention from the border, who are arrested by Customs and Border Protection and not by ICE inside of the country. As to how that relates to the backlog, the answer is since we don't know what's happening with these cases, whether or not they're being put in the detention system, or whether they're being released after they pass a credible fear interview, that is unclear. Generally speaking, backlogs for detained cases are very different than the 1.3 million case backlog for individuals held inside who are released inside of the country, because detained cases are prioritized and generally resolve in a matter of months rather than years, though people can and are held in detention for years as they fight their cases.
I'll just add to Aaron's very thorough response there. One thing in terms of the historical background context for the court backlog is that this is something that has grown over time. It has grown substantially since really the Bush era. And at the end of the Obama administration, it was about 500,000 cases. So now we are at 1.3 million cases at the end of the Trump period. So that's more than a doubling during 4 years of the Trump administration. Some of that is due to overall increased enforcement because the budgets for CBP and ICE have increased substantially at a higher rate than the courts themselves. And it's taken time for attention from Congress to be paid to funding the courts more to increase their apparatus, hire more immigration judges. The judge numbers are at about close to 600 now, which is an increase over time, but not nearly what ICE and CBP have increased to. Another point to note is that the increase during the Trump years was not simply due to more cases coming in, but also the Trump administration's poor processing, poor management of the caseload. They made many changes, as I referenced before, taking away judges' ability to manage their dockets so that judges would be hearing cases that don't need to be before them and on a given day. And that means that it takes up time and it slows down their ability to handle cases that are more pressing that are in front of them. I'm very glad that you made the connection, Farida, between the courts and what's happening at the border. It's very clear that the courts as a medium term or even a short term element are important as a solution to people that are coming in or being put into the removal proceedings. The faster the courts operate and the more efficient they are, the more quickly that the situation at the border or even people in detention, their cases can be handled. And that's why it's such a critical element of the system. We have 2 more questions up here on the screen. So I'll just read this so everybody can hear it from Matt Spitalnik. Can you talk a little bit about what the Biden administration needs to do with Central America and correct whatever mistakes were made with the Obama administration's aid approach? I'm going to ask the second question also, just so it's up on deck here so people can hear it. What is, from Olivia Tallet, what is your take about Harris County Sheriff Ed Gonzalez, selected by the Biden administration to lead ICE? He took the county out of 287G when he became sheriff, but do you have expectations of changes with him leading the agency? So I'm just going to throw this out. Who would like to take up either one of those questions?
I can certainly take the one about what to do about Central America and in sort of looking back from the perspective of what we learned in the Obama administration. One is in terms of the present and how are we going to manage the present. I think many of us look back on what we did in the Obama administration and believe that our efforts to develop legal and safe paths for humanitarian immigration to the U.S. from Central America were too little and too late, and wish we would have done more well beyond the asylum and refugee processes to establish meaningful and safe pathways to travel to come to the U.S. I think absent that in the short term, Doesn't matter, you know, the walls, asylum delays, take your pick. There is going to be persistent migration to the U.S. from Central America because of the very simple fact that if you look at it, the world's highest homicide rates are in 2 of the 3 Northern Triangle countries. And those are the result of severely degraded public institutions, particularly law enforcement institutions, which takes me to number 2. And this is something that the president has talked about, something that I fully expect he is going to act upon, and that is that the U.S. needs to become a partner to the 3 Northern Triangle countries, along with others in the hemisphere, in restoring their rule of law institutions in order to improve their public safety situations to a degree, and their corruption issues to a degree that would, over time, reverse the pushes for migration at the levels that we've been seeing.
I'm just gonna thank you, Leon. I'm gonna add. We've got a follow-up question from Matt. He's specifically wondering how the Biden-Harris administration can avoid the pitfalls on aid distribution with the $4 billion that are being promised. I don't know if you or anybody would like to comment on that follow-up question.
Yeah, well, I think I'm the best positioned, but I think none of us are particularly experts on aid distribution. You know, I do think there needs to be an eye for accountability in terms of how that aid is distributed. You know, there needs to be partnership, but not domination in the manner in which that aid is distributed. I don't think that I or any of the other of us otherwise are sufficiently expert to answer that question. I'm sure there are others who are.
I would certainly echo Leon's overall comment there. I will make one point that, you know, with respect to what Leon was saying about not having foreign aid be used in a domineering way, you know, one concern that AILA would have has been the trend under the Trump administration, but it's also been continued somewhat under the Biden administration, although I think that the signals are still unclear. When aid is used as a condition for Central American countries or Mexico to have to then use their military, their National Guard to implement highly restrictive controls that essentially block migrants and asylum seekers from being able to come north, with the idea that you must stay in those countries to seek protection, when the real problem is that those countries' asylum systems, their ability to screen and protect individuals is very, very much compromised. And if aid is conditioned on that, then I think that creates a problem where those countries really can't provide the protection, and they're not yet at a stage where they're able to be able to really address the root causes in the countries themselves. I don't know if anybody else wants to answer that, but I'll re-put on deck just the question from Olivia Tallett about Harris County Sheriff Ed Gonzalez being selected to head ICE. If anybody would like to address that. Seeing general head shaking. I will say just one comment because I don't know very much about Ed Gonzalez himself, but I will say that you know, it's important for leadership in ICE to really have somebody who is going to have the credibility with the rank and file of the several thousand ICE officers that are in the field. So that is why oftentimes administrations, both Republican and Democratic, have favored people from a law enforcement background. And it's a very tough position to fill because you need not only that, but you need also essentially the policy chops to deal with very complicated immigration policies that are going in. So not knowing Ed Gonzalez's overall background, I would say it's important that he does have a law enforcement background. Perhaps I'll give him some credibility, but I don't have much more to comment besides that. That is the last. Actually, we have one more from Diane Solis, but Jorge, you were going to make a comment?
Just quickly, I mean, the one thing I'll say regarding the question about Mr. Gonzalez, this is from the perspective of the council, this is a very important opportunity for change. ICE, as Aaron indicated, has become hyper-political in recent years. The agency was at the forefront of many of the worst of Trump's abuses on immigration. So Mr. Gonzalez will be very well positioned to not only reverse the trends at ICE under Trump, but also to hopefully build a system that is more fair, to reduce ICE detention levels, to close ICE detention facilities, and also to adopt and implement generous prosecutorial discretion guidelines to help protect people as well.
Thank you, Jorge. We have another question here from Diane Solis. First, as COVID infections go down, do we see Title 42 ending? I realize many view Title 42 as unlawful. If Title 42 is lifted, what kind of pressure will it place on the system, the immigration system, for change, and where should the change be focused? Aaron, or would somebody else like to answer that?
I think that what we can say on Title 42 is, do we see it going down? I think this administration has shown that, especially through comments made by the press secretary and the president himself, that Title 42 is not particularly linked to public health at this point, that it has largely been viewed as a political move to keep in place. That said, there are serious concerns dealing with how to process people in a time of COVID, including rapid testing and the need to ensure that Border Patrol officers and others who interact with migrants have been vaccinated. So we are not trying to downplay any of the concerns, which are very real about the spread of COVID. But as noted, COVID infections have been going down in the United States. Now, half of all American adults have received at least one shot of vaccination, and those numbers are just going to keep going up. And I would further note that 340,000 people cross the border every single day from Mexico into the United States through ports of entry, and not a single one of them has to get a COVID test or indeed has any sort of checks for COVID done. So we are seeing cross-border traffic, even under current travel restrictions, slowly reverting back to normal. It is now above 60% of what it was before the pandemic hit. 10.5 million people crossed from Mexico into the United States last month through the legal ports of entry. And so that more than twice as many people cross the border through a legal port of entry every single day that are apprehended in a single month. So the public health rationales are increasingly threadbare, and the Biden administration should instead be focusing their efforts on envisioning a world without Title 42, one in which the ports of entry are open to those seeking asylum so that individuals do not have to end up in dangerous situations in Mexico waiting for an unknown period of time, and one in which there is extensive planning on the US side of the border to ensure that no one is held in unsafe conditions, such as rapid testing, quarantine if necessary with non-governmental organizations, and release on recognizance and other forms of non-custodial processing, which we are seeing with families and which has a proven success record, with especially with things like alternatives to detention. The answer should not be to send more people to detention, when ending Title 42. The answer should be safe and effective border management strategies.
Thank you, Aaron. We have no further questions here on deck. Give one last opportunity for somebody to hand raise or type quickly into the chat box. And while people are maybe populating that, I'll just say any final comments here from the speakers. Seeing and hearing. For Leon and Chev from Farida, again, what is the number one step the administration could take to reform the asylum system from the USCIS perspective?
I can go. I mean, I think the first thing it needs to do is to restore the asylum definition to what it was prior to the matter of AB case, to make it a more robust and real remedy for people escaping the kinds of persecution that they're experiencing in Central America, focusing on gang violence and domestic violence, and the failure of public institutions to protect people from those harms.
Yeah, I mean, and I think I would just add to that in general, the asylum applicants are also suffering from these crisis level processing delays. They were stuck with some really arbitrary and damning rejection policies from the last administration that for many people, they lost out their chance to actually file their applications because they were rejected for leaving a space blank that wasn't applicable to them. And so the administration really needs to find some recourse for those individuals who lost out on their opportunity to even file their application because of that policy.
Thank you both. Two quick other comments on that question about asylum. First of all, the asylum training process given for USCIS adjudicators was changed during the Trump administration. There are a lot of concerns that those standards made it much more difficult, as Leon was talking about, in terms of what constitutes asylum, what qualifies it for credible fear. Credible fear is meant as an initial threshold to determine whether or not somebody would then get an opportunity to come before a judge for a full asylum determination. So that training protocol really needs to be looked at to make sure it is consistent with the law and not overly restrictive. The other thing that I would just flag is in the border context, one of the proposals that AILA has supported is for the asylum officers who are doing those initial credible fears to be given the authority to be able to actually then, once they determine somebody has a credible fear of asylum, go ahead and make the full asylum determination of the case before them, rather than have the person then get bumped to having a hearing before a judge. Typically, asylum officers only hear what are considered affirmative asylum applications. The immigration courts hear what are defensive cases where somebody's put into removal proceedings, which is what happens in the border context typically. But there's no reason why asylum officers couldn't also hear those cases after they've passed the initial credible fear determination. That would make the process so much more efficient at the border, and that's exactly what we need here for a fair and efficient border processing, border management system. I think we've got another question. Another one, can you please confirm, this is from Farida.
Yeah.
Did Chev say the blank space policy is still in place, Chev?
Yeah, so through litigation, USCIS agreed to stop rejecting blank space application for asylum U and T applications. However, they still have not provided recourse for those individuals who were rejected under that policy. That's still being negotiated. So that needs to happen soon. And so that there's relief from that policy. The other thing I would flag is that we see that even though it was specifically announced for those 3 form types that they would reject, we've seen it slip in other types of cases. And so we're remaining vigilant to ensure that that idea that a space that's not material for eligibility, if left blank, or if they use a terminology other than N/A, doesn't result in unfair rejections.
Thank you, Chev. Any final questions? Okay. We are at the hour here of 12:30 on the East Coast. I'm going to thank all of the speakers. Thank you, Leon, Chev, Aaron, and Jorge for giving your time to this. We thank all the press members for joining our conference. And I'm going to now turn it over to Tessa to just close us out. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg, and thank you everyone for joining us. You can find the Council's new report tracking the Biden agenda on legal immigration in the first 100 days on the Council's homepage, and AILA's chart tracking what has been accomplished and what remains to be done by the Biden administration on AILA's homepage. I will also be following up via email with these reports and a recording of the call. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me or Maria Frosto. Thank you again.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank
Folks.
you, everyone.